For those of you I've not met, my name is Erica. I use she, her pronouns, and one of the pastors here at Press House. So before I begin, just a show of hands, how many people have heard this story before from Genesis 22? Yeah, it's familiar? So, okay, some of you not. So just a recap, in case you were like, what the hell is going on? Yes, God tells Abraham to go take his son and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. That really is what we just read. And I really dislike this text from Genesis 22. In fact, when Miato and I were planning this, and he was actually one who was supposed to originally preach it, and then we had to do a little switcheroo, and I was like, dang it, I have to do Genesis 22. The binding of Isaac, in Hebrew, the Akedah. It is a deeply disturbing story which makes my whole body instinctively recoil. I am a parent, after all. When I hear religious people lift Abraham up as an example of faithfulness to God because he was willing to sacrifice his own son, I am repelled, disgusted. What kind of God would demand such a cruel test? If this is what it means to follow God, then count me out. As Laura said, we are in our 4th week of our series, Problematic Faves. And this story is most definitely problematic. It is a text that is traditionally read by Jews during Rosh Hashanah, making it a fave. They read this every single year. But why? Why? Why read and remember this horror story from the Bible? Can you imagine as a child going to synagogue and being like, oh, Happy New Year. What is this story? Why would we read this story? Why would they read this story as a way to mark the beginning of a new year? So, knowing that Jews have a much longer tradition of exegeting these texts, I texted one of my rabbi friends and said, help, I really do not like this story. And I'm grateful for the wisdom of our Jewish siblings, for their rich discussions in the Talmud and the Midrash, which have produced a multitude of other narratives to expand our imaginations and open up possibilities for what this story can teach us. Because yes, I do think it actually has something to teach us. So over the past week, I listened to many different perspectives from the Akedah project. That's maybe something we'll link in the email or on the website, so if you're curious, you can see it yourself. It features scholars, artists, and rabbis exploring the story from feminists, transgender, Jews of color, and all sorts of different lenses. I read poems that imagine the story from the perspective of Sarah, Isaac's mother and Abraham's husband, who is noticeably absent from Genesis 22, as well as poems imagining the story from the perspective of the ram, who unfortunately found itself tangled up in the bush, and then taking the place of Isaac's on the altar. Encountering the multitude of interpretations was an affirmation of how the word that we read in scriptures is living and active, and it reminds us of how our specific context shapes how we receive a story. So even as we settle on an interpretation that resonates with the times we are living in, we are cautioned against thinking there is only one way of interacting with this story. So with these things in mind, let's dig in, discover what we might learn. So to begin, in case it wasn't clear, let's name some of the problematic elements in this story. First, God tests Abraham by telling him to sacrifice his son as a burnt offering. Actually, that's 2 problems. The fact that God tests Abraham at all is unsettling. And the test itself, child sacrifice, it is abhorrent. It actually goes against God's own commands in the Bible. Second, Abraham. Abraham puts up zero protest when he is told to go kill his own son. And that is in stark contrast to just a few chapters earlier in Genesis 18, when he argues quite extensively with God about not destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. Third problem, Abraham consults no one. No one, doesn't talk to anybody, just moves forward alone in this act, deceiving everyone around him, including his own spouse, his son, his servants. Finally, actually, there's probably more problems, but these are the ones I'm going to highlight. Finally, an angel of the Lord announces that because Abraham was willing to kill his son as a sacrifice, Abraham will be blessed. Blessed because his descendants will become as numerous as the sand and the stars. I don't know about you, but everything about this story undermines the sense of who I believe God to be and what it looks like to be faithful. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this really problematic story? There are actually a number of other narratives in the Talmud and the Midrash that give alternate versions of this story, where it's actually not God who lays out this test before Abraham, but Satan. In another rendition, the son who was almost sacrificed is not Isaac, but Ishmael, who we heard about a few weeks ago when Niato preached. But I actually think that is no less disturbing. It's actually maybe more disturbing. One of the more interesting variations I read has Sarah, Abraham's wife, Isaac's mother, has Sarah intervening when she learns of Abraham's plans. And so she secretly brings up a ram up the mountain, calls out in an angelic voice, "Abraham, Abraham," so that Abraham would see it in the bushes and sacrifice the ram that she led up the mountain instead of Isaac. They're fascinating. They offer up other ways of making sense of this difficult text. For today, though, I want to focus upon the story as we have read it, as Aurora read it, and consider what possible lessons we might learn. So there are 3 observations that I came across which struck me as particularly relevant for the times that we are living in. The first comes from Dr. Aaron Kohler, who's a professor at Yeshiva University, who says this: "The notion that sincere individual faith can license the suspension of all ethical considerations is a deeply dangerous idea." I'll say that again. The notion that sincere individual faith can license the suspension of all ethical considerations is a deeply dangerous idea. One's religious devotion cannot take precedence over the welfare of others. In a country that purports freedom of religion as one of its basic tenets, there has been much debate about how this actually works in a pluralistic society with people who have many different kinds of faith. How much do people's faith convictions get to play out when they have a direct impact upon other people? Dr. Kohler would say, and I agree, that if you want to sacrifice yourself because of your faith, well, that is between you and your God. However, if you want to sacrifice someone else for your faith, no way, or as many of you know, I would say no effing way. That is actually a breach of faith and directly undermines what we understand to be the greatest commandment of all: love your neighbor. Simply put, using your belief system to justify harming others is wrong. It is wrong. The second observation comes from Elliot Glassenberg, a queer Jewish educator and activist who shares a framework for interpreting difficult biblical texts such as Genesis 22. So remembering, this story doesn't come to us in isolation. It resides amongst a collection of texts and traditions that expands our understanding of what might be going on. So this story, when it was first told, originally told in long time ago, it was when child sacrifice in the ancient Near East was common practice. And that practice was seen as especially antithetical to what it meant to be Jewish. If you look in Leviticus 18:21, there is actually an explicit prohibition against offering one's own offspring to the Canaanite god Molech. In the Torah, which is what our Jewish siblings call the first books of the Bible that we call the Old Testament, the overarching themes consistently emphasize life. It emphasizes life. It is easy to get caught up in debates about Levitical codes and like, oh, we're supposed to do this, we're supposed to do that, and then miss the primary point of these texts. They were a guide to stay alive. That was the point, to stay alive. We see in Deuteronomy 30:19 an exhortation to the Israelites to choose life so that their descendants may live. From the time of the Talmud, there was this understanding that saving a life, that took precedence over keeping the law of Shabbat. So Jews could break one Shabbat in order to survive, because then they would be alive to be able to celebrate many more Shabbats. We see this also affirmed in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, when on the Sabbath, the disciples who were hungry were walking through a cornfield and they plucked grains to eat. When the Pharisees, who were the religious scholars of the time, pointed out that the disciples were breaking the law, Jesus responded by entering a synagogue and healing a man with a withered hand, further accentuating his point that it was lawful to do good things on the Sabbath, regardless of the technical rule. Jesus blasted religious folks for completely missing the point of God's command. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Mercy, not sacrifice. Unsurprisingly, the Pharisees were more interested in condemning the guiltless, and from that point on, they sought to destroy Jesus. The significance is the same for us today. We are supposed to choose life over rules and religion. When we read this scriptural text, the interpretations we should give more weight to, like I said, you can interpret all sorts of things, but the ones that I think we should be paying more attention to are the ones that call us towards life, where the assumption is love and the default is grace. The question we should ask ourselves is this: when I read this and when I interpret it, does it lead us closer to wholeness, to restored relationship with God and one another? Do the implications of our understanding result in more life? That leads me to the final observation about the story, one that has been made by many feminist theologians. While many, and I will say mostly male theologians, claim that Genesis 22 is a testament to Abraham's faithfulness, others recognize it as Abraham's utter failure. He failed the test. The consequences were terrible. The consequences were terrible, and they followed for the remaining days of his life. First, when Abraham chose this blind and radical devotion to his religion, he condemned another person to death and did irreversible harm. After nearly dying at the hands of his own father, Isaac never talked to Abraham for the rest of his life. Sarah, who was conspicuously absent from the scene, in the next chapter immediately dies, presumably from the shock and grief of this incredibly traumatic event. And God, after this moment in interaction with Abraham, never spoke directly to him again. This is the fruit of Abraham's unquestioning adherence to his religion: broken relationships and alienation from those who mattered the most to him. Read with these observations in mind, the story of the binding of Isaac becomes a cautionary tale for those of us who live in a time when Christian nationalism is on the rise and on full display by many who hold positions of power in our country as they use twisted theologies to justify their abuse and violence. Let us be clear. Devotion to a religion that sacrifices others is not only wrong, it leads directly to broken relationships, alienation, and death. No matter what text a person can quote, if one's discernment does not lead to the preservation of life, love of others, and restoration of relationship, you can safely assume it is not of God. Whew. The story of Abraham and him binding Isaac from Genesis 22. I think it reminds us that faith Faith is not about proving ourselves. In fact, you can lose what matters most while technically getting things right, as Abraham did. Instead of trying to twist ourselves into following Abraham's example, we are invited to question and wrestle beyond the text on the page. That is what faithfulness looks like. As those in power are weaponizing the religion with threatening certainties, let us lean in a different direction. Let us venture into stories that expand our possibilities for more life and wander down grace-filled paths that draw us closer to God's mercy and Christ's scandalous love. To close, I want to share the poem. It's called The Place Where We Are Right. It's by Israeli poet and novelist Yehuda Amichai. And I share this poem because I think in a time when people are really intent on proving themselves right, it is a good reminder. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow. And a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. Amen.